Too late.
All right, quick, lock the door.
Oh, there's another car.
Yeah, well, they got to learn. So, good afternoon to everyone. And we are continuing our march through the life of Abraham and Sarah and all of the people attached to them. Or let's say semi-attached. Isn't that the real estate term that's used? Or is it semi-detached? Because we have a figure that is connected to Abraham, but also kind of not connected. It's this sort of hanger-on that has been there since the very end of Noah, and then more prominently in Lech Lecha. And in Vayera, he gets finally center stage. Who could this character be? Who is the hanger-on of Avram and then Abraham? Lot. Lot. Everyone's favorite guy. Now, we're not going to talk about the incident with the daughters. That'll be for another time, although there will be a hint of why that incident happened today. We're going to talk instead about the area that gets the most famous Lot attention, which is the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So Sodom and Gomorrah were among and representative of the cities of the plain. We met these cities last parasha, last week, when Lot had already gone to live there because it looked like a good place to live. That is to say, it was wealthier rather than actually having to be a shepherd, even though being a shepherd had made him very wealthy. He decided to liquidate his flocks and invest in palm trees, I guess. So we met them when they were at war in last week's parasha, which Abraham had to go and save their bacon and shoelaces and other things, but mostly to save Lot, who had been caught up. And now it comes to Abraham to try and save Lot and his family again. So we're going to just do a quick recap of the prelude to the destruction, because I want to actually talk about the destruction. So Abraham is having a conversation with God, and God says, I need to talk to Abraham about what I'm about to do, right? He and his descendants are going to follow in my ways. They need to understand these things. You don't want to blow up some cities without explaining to Abraham why I'm doing this, or else Abraham may not understand what God means by justice. What explanation is giving for the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah?
They were not walking in Hashem's way.
What does that mean?
They don't. Hashem doesn't specify.
Okay, thank you. We don't get any specifics. No. We don't get any specifics in the text itself. Now we get some
outcry.
There's an outcry against them, and we get some characteristic behavior shown by them and how they treat the visitors, the angels that show up in town, which, by the way, despite what the word Sodom has come to mean in modern English, the general understanding by the commentators of the outcry was not about what they were intending to do physically to the men that had come as visitors to the town, but the fact that they were going to attack visitors was considered the great crime. It was the inhospitality that was more important than the particular sexual act that was being discussed. The sexual act became the byword for Sodom because English is weird, but that was really, if you wanted to talk about sodomite behavior in the biblical and in the rabbinic commentary section, then you should be discussing being inhospitable to guests.
That's also in Ezekiel.
Yes, yeah. So
Specific.
Yes, the specific observation, exactly. It's not a modern liberal interpretation. The classic interpretation of what was probably the biggest problem in Sodom was the way they treated people who came to town, the way they treated strangers, the way they treated outsiders. That seems to have been the biggest problem. And that is why Lot, who is willing to meet these strangers in the town square and willing to give them a place to stay, he is a standout. He still is exhibiting the behavior of Abraham, right? Who was also somebody who was willing to greet people even in the heat of the day. So Lot does have some Abraham characteristics, but also not perfectly, because he's a bit of a nebbish. He's not really very good at following through on these things. So he tries to defend them. And when you do the math, Abraham had argued God down to not destroying the cities if they could at least find 10. And if you add up the number of people who are left after all is said and done, you don't get 10. Right? You have Lot, you have Lot's wife, and you got his 2 girls. If you'd been able to get his married daughters and their husbands, we might have been able to tip the scales and save the whole town, or save all the cities, actually. But instead, we don't even get 10 in one family, let alone throughout the rest of the cities. Okay.
Lot's son-in-laws, they left the thing.
Absolutely. And in fact, we're going to pick up right after their laughter. That's where we're going to start on today's reading. So we're on page 106, which is Genesis 19, chapter 19, verse 15. Yeah, and they basically thought that that Lot was crazy. It's crazy talk. Like, what are you? Get out of here, you silly guy.
Did Lot count in the number of good men in Sodom and Gomorrah?
So he never officially gets counted, because we never get to a count. But if you read between the lines, that if you add up the number of people who make it out, who are rescued from the cities, right, we are still short. And if you were able to add in the son-in-laws plus his married daughters, we might have been able to tip, especially if you wanted to go real sneaky and say, well, how about if we also include the 2 angels? Because certainly they're righteous. But we never officially get a stamp of approval that he is a righteous guy. Some of his later behavior is a little questionable. But he's really sort of that in-between kind of person, right? Yeah. That he's not really evil, and he's not really inherently good. He's sometimes good, and sometimes he just, no.
The only question I had is, does he kind of just move this? So it seems like, to what extent do they count if you import them?
Well, if you're trying to save a city, you're going to probably use any trick you can, but they couldn't even get that. Okay, so we're on 19:15. Do I have a, thank you, volunteer?
As dawn broke, the angels urged Lot on, saying, "Up, take your wife and your 2 remaining daughters, lest you be swept away because of the iniquity of the city." Right.
So remember, all of this incident had happened over the previous night, where he had brought home the strangers to his house, and then they were assaulted by the neighbors, and then there was a whole fight at the door when he said, "Take my daughters, please." Yeah. Which again is not exactly a standout moment for Lot. But by the next morning, after the angels had saved the household, he still hasn't convinced the rest of his family to go, and the angels are saying, "Go."
Yeah, of course, there's the other famous scene later in Genesis where dawn breaks and an angel is urging Israel on, like dawn, on Israel.
Yes.
After the struggle.
Yes.
After a bad night.
Yes, after another bad night. A lot of bad nights sometimes. Okay, onward.
Still, he delayed. So the men seized his hand and the hands of his wife and his 2 daughters in the Lord's mercy on him, and brought him out and left him outside the city.
All right, so why is he delaying?
Maybe he's trying to convince his daughters.
He still has kids there,
yeah,
right? I mean, his 2 daughters, despite their son-in-laws, who were clearly normal members of the congregation. Why do people call me at noon? It's like the most common time for people to call me. But they go to lunch, but I'm teaching on Wednesdays at noon. And it's like in every bulletin, on every email, it's always mentioned. Okay, because that wasn't a telemarketer, that was someone who should have known. Okay, so yes, he's got these 2 daughters who are married, obviously, to 2 guys who are native to Sodom and not very great. He wants them to leave. He's really holding out, and the angels literally have to drag him out of the city to get him moving.
I also think there's something in Lot's character of always trying to somehow figure out how can I get the most out of this.
Have the cake and eat it too.
Yeah. So, leaving, he doesn't have those sheep anymore outside. They're not, he's trying to figure out, well, can I take all of this?
So you see him as packing more and more and more, and the angel's like, no, leave it.
Leaving, and you only get this, your daughter and the 2.
And your wife.
He's lingering between the choice he made to live there
mm-hmm.
and where his property is.
Yep.
And knowing that these are angels, they are from God.
Yep.
So his faith and his material
Material,
possessions are
Right, and
It's not a good place for him right now.
It's not,
for any
yeah,
of us.
but it's a difficult,
Well, for any of us, although if we were in a situation where we had the same clarity of understanding that these indeed are malachim, they are angels, and there is a destruction coming to the city, I'd like to imagine the vast majority of us would leave it behind to save our lives.
Remember when he moved there because he saw it. He saw
Oh,
its
yeah.
beauty. He saw how lovely it was. And it still looks lovely at this point in the text.
Absolutely, but he's also got incontrovertible evidence that things are about to not look so lovely. Okay, so onward. Oh, is that a question or was that a comment?
It was another comment.
Please.
Sometimes you get comfortable where you are with your wealth and your place and your stuff and your neighbors and everything. And leaving it and knowing you're leaving all your possessions and everything behind, the future is so blank that you're more afraid of that than of not having a future.
That is very true,
yeah,
which is
really,
one of the reasons why some commentators say it was God's mercy that took him out, because he probably didn't actually deserve it himself. Right? He was dipping into the Sodomite way of looking at things, which is possessions are more important than anything else. He wasn't permanently attached, maybe, but he was so enmeshed that without external help, he wouldn't have got himself out of there.
and
He was stuck, and he needed some other compassion to overcome his inertia. Right.
and every time he's stuck,
Mm-hmm.
Uncle Abraham shows up and saves him. You know, it's like, well, okay, but every other instance in his life, his family has come to, and here they are again, but they're saying, you have to get out.
Yep.
And he's, well, can't you, fix something for me? I can see this guy going.
And are we going to read far enough into the text to get to the point where Lot's saying, well, what if I flee to that little city?
We
over
are
there?
indeed,
Give me a little something for.
Exactly. Do I have to go so far? Very true. Did you have a?
Well, I was gonna just say that the Lord took care of Lot, I believe, sometimes because he was Abraham's.
There is definitely a feeling of Lot on his own might not be getting the same amount of help as Lot, the nephew of Abraham. But that's not necessarily just that God was going out of his way, or might also be that Lot, being the nephew of Abraham, some of Abraham had rubbed off on him. And there were these good sparks in him. I mean, he saw two guys in the city square, and he knew it was bad for what it would happen with his neighbors, and he knew that it would be worse for the guys if he left them there. And he took the risk to bring them into his house. And he may not have handled the rest of the situation beautifully, but he does have the spark of doing the right thing. So being the nephew of Abraham is not just about getting bonus brownie points with God. It also is that he does have the right sparks going on inside of him, he's not firing on all cylinders. All right, onward.
When they had brought them outside, one said, "Flee for your life. Do not look behind you, nor stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the hills, lest you be swept away." But Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lord, you have been so gracious to your servant, and have already shown me so much kindness in order to save my life. But I cannot flee to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Look, that town there is near enough to flee to. It is such a little place. Let me flee there. It is such a little place, and let my life be saved." He replied, "Very well, I will grant you this favor too, and I will not annihilate the town of which you have spoken. Hurry, flee there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive there." Hence the town came to be called Zoar.
All right, so he is able to negotiate, which is also another sign of Abraham. He's able to negotiate at least this little part rather than having to go so far away. So yes, he's not quite ready to leave everything behind, and the angel is willing to give him that respite. Now, if he had left earlier, maybe he could have gotten further, but he had delayed that whole time. So we can also argue about whether it's his own fault.
Why is his ability to negotiate similar to Abraham? Because Abraham was negotiating to save other people, but it seems like he was negotiating his own interests.
Right.
True, although he did save Zoar, right? He did save the town.
By going there.
By going there, he saved the town.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yes. So, I mean, because that's why he keeps reminding it's a little place, it's a little place. He's basically saying whatever the iniquity might be of that town, it must be so small that it's not needed to be destroyed, right? Because there are only, so few people there. So that it's small, so God can overlook its crimes while he's busy destroying everything else. So that's the import of repeating that it's just a little place, right? It's just a little crime. It's a misdemeanor town.
But doesn't that, the fact that he wants to go there instead of someplace with no crime, isn't that kind of like hanging on to that kind of lifestyle?
Yeah. Yeah. That's like I said, this guy's not perfect. All right, let's get to the Big Bang.
As the sun rose upon the earth and Lot entered Zoar, the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah sulfurous fire from the Lord out of heaven. He annihilated those cities and the entire plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities and the vegetation of the ground. Lot's wife looked back, and she thereupon turned into a pillar of salt. Next morning, Abraham hurried to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and looking down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and all the land of the plain, he saw the smoke of the land rising like the smoke of a kiln. Thus it was that when God destroyed the cities of the plain and annihilated the cities where Lot dwelt, God was mindful of Abraham and removed Lot from the midst of the upheaval.
All right. Rough, yes? To have this destruction. Again, Sodom and Gomorrah are representative, but all of the cities of the plain were actually destroyed during this calamity. So how did it happen? How were they destroyed?
It starts off with.
What did it look like if you're the movie producer?
Poison gas.
Okay, so, well, from anyone, so if you got cameras set up all around this area.
You're going to see.
Fire and brimstone.
Fire out of heaven and then smoke coming up like a dell.
Okay, so.
Actually, it says there's a
Hot one.
wind, a gas coming out. I think it's one of the first things they say.
The sulfurous, it rained, sulfurous fire,
Yeah.
right? Well, is one way of reading it. And then, we just know that it's annihilated, right? That the cities are overturned is more in keeping with the literal Hebrew translation. And then we've also got this saltness happening.
And the smoke from Abraham's seed.
And then the smoke left, it's like smoke coming up out of a kiln. Okay, so.
Israel today
Mhm.
uses that area for gathering huge amounts of potash and.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I mean,
It's rich in many minerals, yes.
Many minerals that
And-
put together into certain combinations become bombs. I
Well-
mean, really just.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit here. So first of all, we've got rain in quotes from heaven. What does heaven mean? Okay, well, hold on. So one is when we talk about heaven, when we say Shemaim in Hebrew, we can mean literally that large bit of atmosphere that is over our heads, right? That's when we say Shemaim. That's a perfectly reasonable translation in English. Is we're talking about the sky, which would mean that when we say it rained from heaven, we would be talking about the location of the rain as it fell down. Make sense? Right. But what else can heaven mean?
God's abode.
Right. God's house. Because it's catchier than a boat. that this is not coming, we're not talking about the location of the rain. We're talking about its ultimate origin. that its ultimate origin is with God, either metaphorically, meaning God caused it to happen, right? If we say someone was punished from heaven, we don't always immediately look up to look at where the punishment came from. We say, no, it started with a decision from heaven. Or it could be saying that this is special fire and stuff that doesn't come from the earth, that this is a supernatural destruction. And these types of elements don't occur just from the sky. That it's as though a portal between heaven and earth opened and you get down all of this stuff. All right, so with that in mind, let's take a look at what our commentators try to do with this. So we have Radak first.
The origin of this lethal rain was very high up in the sky.
All right, so Radak takes a side. He says, when it says it rained down, it's talking about the Weather Channel, right? It's giving a specific meteorological kind of description that what happened here was literally raining down from high up in the sky, right? This isn't being used just as an origin explanation. Now, one of the reasons why it's even more important to get this clear in this particular verse is because this particular verse isn't particularly clear. You may have noticed in the English even that it said, the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah sulfurous fire from the Lord, which out of heaven, which is a lot of lords for one sentence. And that's one of the things the commentators are picking up on, is when it says the Lord rained from the Lord, are we saying that what's going on here? Is this just a rain? Is this a heaven source? Is it just a particular description of what it felt like? So that's one reason why the commentators all chime in on this.
The Everett Fox translation does exactly that. It's very hard to get through it.
Oh, there you go. Okay, so let's go ahead and see what Sephorno says about this whole activity.
This was not a natural event, such as a volcanic eruption. The ash, brimstone, and lava afterwards descending on the surrounding earth.
Right, so he's saying it's not like a volcano. Right, so for those of you that are looking for a natural event here, that there was, somehow natural gas leaking up from beneath the earth and it got set off in a spark that exploded and sent all of the sulfurous elements and potash and other things into the mix, which then caused like a fuel air explosion that cascaded upon itself and really uprooted the entire. No, this is not, they got the pipes wrong. This is a supernatural explosion. So it wasn't so much about the sky. It really was about God doing this. And you would not be able to predict this just by using the right barometer. Make sense of what he's saying? So instead, he says...
Actually, this one says basically what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't come from the ground. It came from above.
So go ahead and keep reading that, right?
The source of this destruction did not originate in the bowels of the earth.
Right, because why are we saying sky even still, right, rather than is it only just because it's indicating this? It's because it's reminding us that this type of destruction, which is indicative of a geological destruction, wasn't geological, but was instead sky directed in order to tell us that the true source of the destruction was God, right? So he's trying to say the reason why you get this really weird sentence structure is to say, normally this kind of explosion and brimstone and sulfur and stuff like that, that just smells like a volcano, right? And people around Europe knew what volcanoes were. Anyone who'd ever been to Italy knew what volcanoes were. And all across, of course, the Greek islands and such, the legends and experiences of volcanoes and earthquakes were alive and well in many people's living memory, or at least in the cultural memory. And Sforno is saying, right? I know it may sound like this was a ground-based destruction by all the elements that we've got here, but the verse is telling us it's from the sky to tell us this was not something that had a natural explanation.
There is some people that still think it is volcanic eruption, because they say, how come suddenly the Dead Sea became the lowest point in the...
Became deader.
Yeah.
And that's very true. I mean, those that are familiar with the geology of the region know that this area along the Jordan Valley, this is a tectonic plate. This is a crack. It's called the Rift Valley. It goes all the way from there down into Africa. And this Rift Valley is geologically active. Yes, exactly. So
and violent, and when it does do things.
Right. So where the Seforno certainly didn't understand plate tectonics, but he did want to tell those people who said, this sounds like a geological thing. Not that they had the word geology exactly, but they knew what ground-based things look like, that this wasn't ground-based. The verse is saying it was heaven-based. Okay. So, but let's go back into why it happened in the way that it happened and why we got a few other details.
When the morning broke, as it is said in verse 15, and when the morning dawned, that is the time when the moon is in the sky together with the sun. As some of them worship the sun and others the moon, the Holy One, blessed be he, said, if I punish them by day, the moon worshippers may say, if it had taken place at night when the moon rules, we would not have been destroyed. And if I punish them by night, the sun worshippers may say, if it had taken place at daytime when the sun rules, we would not have been destroyed. For this reason it is written, and when the morning dawned, he punished them at that time when both moon and sun are ruling.
Right? So why did he have to wait for exactly that moment? Why not just blow up whenever it was convenient? Why give us the detail about the morning dawn? Precisely to say this would prevent them from saying, you know what, we wouldn't be exploding if it had been at noon.
How have they been destroyed? Are they saying anything?
Absolutely the right question, and why we have the next comment. Right? So Siftei Chachamim, who we've heard from a few times before, is what we call a super commentary. That doesn't mean it has like an S and a K. A super commentary means it's a commentary on a commentary. So Siftei Chachamim have written commentary for Rashi. So Rashi brought this, which was from the Midrash, and their first question is, if they're all dead, how are they learning anything? And so let's go ahead and read his response to that.
God said, if I punish them by day, question, they will all be destroyed. How then will they be able to say this? The answer is, Hashem wanted to demonstrate that they did not repent when they saw the punishment begin, although they had no excuse not to.
Right, so that's the first explanation from Maharshal, right? So he's trying to say, look, there was going to be a moment where the people saw the destruction coming. And yeah, they were going to be wiped out. But during that window, when they saw it happening and they were dead, they had a choice to say, oh dear God, what we've been doing was horrible. And he wanted to make sure that they would have that full choice. So God was actually being compassionate here by taking out both of the celestial gods, because otherwise in that window, one group might say, oh, if it was only nighttime, this wouldn't be happening. And then they'd be wiped out without ever having repented. By getting rid of both the moon and the sun as possible protectors, they're left going, nothing could have saved us from this except God, and God's only doing this because we were bad. I guess we were bad. Oh dear, that's really horrible. I should have lived my life differently. And then they're dead. Right? Repentance, even with execution, is the ideal in Jewish law for serious criminals. You're not supposed to be executed without actually repenting. And Maharshal is saying this was God's way of, killing them, but also making it easier to repent by getting rid of these excuses they might have come up with.
Also, is it in Jewish law you do not execute judgment in nighttime hours?
Oh, well, in Jewish law, yes.
This is how justice is done.
Yes.
This is about the doing of justice.
Yeah, but not under the cover of night. We don't execute people. Yeah.
So we wait till there's light.
And then we kill them.
That only applies if people are actually doing the execution, right? Because during the Passover.
During the Passover, yes. But the Passover killing of the firstborn wasn't an execution for the firstborn's particular crimes, but for the national crime of the whole country. It wasn't that particular firstborn had been bad.
That doesn't mean you can do it at night, though. But
we can't, no.
Right, but God can do it anytime.
God can do when he wants to, yeah. All right, but that's not the only issue here.
However, this is not a question. Rashi means that the sun and moon worshippers in other places would say this, not those in Sodom who were destined for destruction. You might object to this answer. Rashi says, we would not have been destroyed, implying that those in Sodom are saying this about themselves.
Right, so there's another way to half answer it by saying, no, this is an example for everyone else, but really Rashi said we won't be destroyed, which does make it sound like it's about them. So the answer is?
The answer is people in other places could speak in this manner too, identifying with them as if they were speaking about themselves. This is similar to Shemos 18:9, in which Rashi explains, Yisro's flesh felt sharp stinging as he was grieved by the destruction of Egypt.
Right, so what he's basically trying to say is other idolaters might have been learning from this example, and even though it says we wouldn't have been destroyed and they're not living in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would be speaking about it as though they were. And if that sounds a little far-fetched, how many times have we spoken about we throughout Jewish history, even if we are alive in the 21st century and we're talking about events that happened hundreds, 500 or more years in the past? You know, we fought against the Romans. No, I'm sorry, none of us in this room fought against the Romans, unless you had a very exciting holiday last year in Italy. We haven't fought against them, but we act, we talk, we even emotionally feel like we were involved in so much of our history and so much of what happens to Jews in other countries, even in our own present day, that we use that first person plural. And that's what Siftei Chachamim is saying can explain why they would have talked that way, even if they weren't personally involved in the destruction, and how you end up with people talking that way after the destruction. Make sense? Good. Neat little side, but we need to get back to our main course.
At first it was rain to see whether they would repent, and this was then turned into brimstone and fire.
All right, so again, coming back to this verse, which is so interesting, right? Why is it himtir? Why is it starting with this phrase rain? Which, by the way, is also in an unusual conjugation pattern for biblical Hebrew. This is often called the past perfect pattern of biblical Hebrew, by having the subject before the verb, which is unusual in biblical Hebrew. It makes it sound like, and God had reigned, as though it had occurred prior to what comes next. And this is sort of lending more support to the idea that the destruction didn't happen with like, what was that 80s TV show, miniseries, The Day After? Remember when they tried to, what would happen with an actual nuclear war? And it's just everybody going along down their business, boom! No, is what this commentary is saying. The people of Sodom would have been going about their business, and then a trickle would have begun, a rain would have begun, and that would have given them the opportunity to do tshuva, to repent. And if so, God would have put the brakes on, and it would have stopped. But they didn't, and so the rest of the arsenal came out. Make sense? Maybe? Maybe. Again, trying to show even more what God was trying to teach Abraham in this whole process of this is how justice works. You constantly give warnings, you constantly give room for repentance, you even after you've begun, you give a chance for someone to turn back by starting with something mild, and only when it's absolutely necessary does the hammer come down.
But it seems that the rain would not have been a warning of doom.
Well, it depends on how the rain was looking. I mean, the rain could have been a normal rain, but in an unusual time. It could have been a rain that seemed threatening. And some people, you know, you look at the right kind of rain clouds and you go, those clouds don't look right. And this is exactly. So exactly how it works is less important, again, only if you're a movie director, than the moral lesson that seems to be coming through in these comments, which is this wasn't just God throwing a light switch on the destruction. He didn't just hit the smite button. Okay, onward. Let's talk about the one person of Lot's family that didn't make it out.
She became a pillar of salt. Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra wrote that the word she became in our verse refers to the earth. Hebrew pronouns are gendered even for inanimate objects.
Right, so that phrase is not actually saying she became the earth. It says, and that which is referred to by a feminine pronoun became earth. Now, the antecedent noun in that verse, if you're wondering, we're talking about verse 26, does definitely seem to point towards Lot's wife. So if we were reading this in your English class, and they were to ask you, what does the pronoun, that which is referred to by a feminine pronoun, refer to, you would draw a little arrow back to the word Lot's wife, because that is the closest feminine noun that has been named. However, it doesn't have to be that, because sometimes we do play loose with our pronouns. And Ibn Ezra is saying that what actually happened here was the earth became salt. Right? She still got killed, but the earth is what became salt. So you don't have to worry about the molecular conversion process of turning a human being into salt. But instead, she dies, and the earth around her and all the other earth of the plain is heavily salted in the process, which we do know actually is true. Onward, as he explains further.
Our sages of Bereshit understand that Lot's wife turned into salt herself as punishment for having asked her neighbors for salt on the previous evening, to alert them to the fact that her husband was entertaining guests against the law of the town.
All right, so Bereshit Rabbah, early Midrash collection, they take the other route and say, no. It wasn't that she died and the earth all became salted. It was she died by being put into salt, by being made salt, in order to highlight the transgression she had made, which was, how did anybody know that he had guests? How did they know that Lot had guests? It doesn't say that he was found. And the Midrash goes that Lot's wife was not happy about him violating the laws of their city, of being nice to people. So she went to the neighbors and said, can I borrow some extra salt? Wink, wink, wink. Because I need extra salt. Wink, wink, wink. And that was the tip-off to let them know that her husband had brought someone home. And then they could get the mob together and do what mobs do. So it was a midah keneged midah. It was a punishment that fit her crime. Right? She asked for extra salt, so she got extra salt. All right. Last one before we get to our bridge connection.
The destruction did not commence until Lot had reached Zoar, and that his wife had lagged behind so that the sulfur and fire struck her. The Torah only revealed to us the reason why she had lagged behind. She was always trailing behind her husband, and the suffix
Me'acharav
describes that she was at all times behind them.
All right, so I'm going to pause there for a second because we got to get a little Hebrew deconstruction. If you look back on verse 26, right, it doesn't actually say she turned back.
No.
Right. I mean, if you were to take and type into Google Translate, she turned back, you would not end up with the word me'acharav anywhere in the Google Translate. So what is going on here? They say because she looked, because his wife looked, for she was behind him. Right? They're taking that me'acharav not as back to the way they'd come, but to literally mean that she was behind him. Right? She was looking at what was about to happen because she was lagging. Right? She just wasn't keeping up. And then we have to explain, why wasn't she keeping up? Why was she in the back of the escape group? Remember, there are only 4 people here, so it's not like it should be hard to keep them together. But apparently she just kept delaying and delaying and delaying. And indeed, it may have been her delays in the early morning when the angels were trying to get them out in the first place. But we have an explanation.
The reason she kept lagging behind was that she kept looking backwards, hoping that her daughters would join her. This also explains the angel saying, "Do not look behind you." If correct, this means that he did not forbid her the looking behind per se, but warned her that her lagging behind due to her looking behind was liable to turn her into a victim of the destructive forces overtaking Sodom and the valley.
All right, so many commentaries of modern types, on equal modern types, focus on her looking back as though that had been the biggest taboo thing ever. And how could she look back? And this was terrible. She was looking back and all of that. What Torah Aruch is doing here is saying, no. It wasn't that the angel was saying, don't look. After all, what's the first thing Abraham does in the morning? He goes and has a look, right? It's not that looking at the destruction is particularly bad. It was the fact that looking back would mean you would stay back, right? And that you would linger. And that was where the problem was. If she had been able to run full speed backwards while still staring down into the valley, she would have been fine. Right? It wasn't just having eyeballs on Sodom and Gomorrah that was the problem. It was the fact that her heart was still there because her kids were there. And that meant that she wasn't able to do what was necessary to get herself out of the blast zone. Right? And again, this is also makes a mockery of all those animations, which make a mockery of the text, that try to show something like Lot and his wife and daughters just walking along together, and she turns around and, she gets turned into salt. Makes a lot more sense to imagine Lot and his daughters were way up the hill, getting close into Zoar, and she is like 1 mile, 2 miles back down the trail, just going, I think I might be able to see them. I wish I could see. And as the explosion comes, she is caught up in all of the rain and fire.
So all those pictures, the guides.
I mean, the pillar of Lot's wife, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and not to mention the fact that anything made out of salt would have dissolved years ago. But what are we going to say about tourists? All right, so fighting on the plains is always interesting because it does seem that very cataclysmic things can happen, which is going to lead us in the book of Joshua to our first major battle in the land of Israel, which isn't a battle. And we're going to try and see what we can make sense, how we can make sense of this. This is the Battle of Jericho, the Battle of Jericho. All right, are you still okay reading?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now Jericho was shut up tight because of the Israelites. No one could leave or enter.
What we call a siege.
The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I will deliver Jericho and her king and her warriors into your hands. Let all your troops march around the city and complete one circuit of the city. Do this 6 days, with 7 priests carrying 7 ram's horns preceding the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the horns."
All right, so notice a few things here that are happening, right? 6 days, they are marching around the city. Are they blowing the horns?
No. But are they carrying the ark?
Yes, the ark is proceeding, and they are marching. And how many people are marching around the city?
All the troops.
Exactly,
Plus
right.
7 priests.
So you've got the whole army, you've got the symbols of God's presence on display, and you've got the shofarot that you're not using. And for 6 days, they march once, done. And then they go back to camp. And then the second day, march once, done, back to camp. Get the build up here? Onward?
So on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the horns. And when a long blast is sounded on the horn, as soon as you hear that sound of the horn, all the people shall give a mighty shout. Thereupon the city wall will collapse, and the people shall advance, every man straight ahead.
All right, so that's the plan. Last time, we're going to go 7 times around the city, not just once, which is going to be, well, think about it. If you were in the city, and each of the 6 days prior to that, they had gone 1 lap, and now on the 7th day, you see them begin a 2nd lap. That's already going to start, wait, something's different here. It's a psychological thing, right? And what do we know from when we talked about Rahav and we talked about Jericho before? What do we know is the big problem in Jericho right now?
They're afraid.
They're afraid, right? Their hearts have melted. They are absolutely terrified. And this whole episode is designed to just keep turning up that fear and anticipation, right? Having guys run at the walls with ladders, they know what that is. But this weird silent marching for 6 days, and then on the 7th day changing, and you're like, oh, wait. All right, now the 2nd one, now the 3rd one, now the 4th one. Oh my God, what is this going to do? And
I imagine they would have, on the first day or whatever, when this marching's going around so quiet, I imagine they would have taken their bows and arrows and, knocked off a few.
Well, I don't imagine them marching so close to the walls they can be shot.
Right. Oh, okay.
I don't see them as like marching against the wall.
Yeah. So I mean,
Just far enough.
Yeah, to be seen. Exactly. All right, so let's see how this plays out.
Joshua son of Nun summoned the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests carrying 7 ram's horns precede the ark of the Lord." And he instructed the people, "Go forward, march around the city with the vanguard marching in front of the ark of the Lord." When Joshua had instructed the people, The 7 priests carrying 7 ram's horns advanced before the Lord, blowing their horns, and the ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. The vanguard marched in front of the priests who were blowing the horns, and the rear guard marched behind the ark, with the horns sounding all the time.
All right, now remember as well, the blowing of a horn is usually the sign for battle. Here, the sound is being given this entire time with the exact opposite of battle, with just marching. So again, this is designed to freak out the inhabitants. Because normally you're like, all right, we're waiting. Okay, guys, they're attacking. But here it's, they're just walking. All right, well, we'll come back tomorrow and see what happens. Onward.
But Joshua's orders to the rest of the people were, do not shout, and do not let your voices be heard, and do not let a sound issue from your lips until the moment that I command you. Shout, then you shall shout.
All right, so the rest of the army, rather than going around going, we're so brave, we're so tough, which is what ancient armies always did, is dead silent as they're walking around the city. Again, very unnerving for the people inside.
So he had the ark of the Lord go around the city and complete one circuit. Then they returned to camp and spent the night at camp. Joshua rose early the next day, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. While the 7 priests bearing the 7 ram's horns marched in front of the ark of the Lord, blowing the horns as they marched. The vanguard marched in front of them, and the rear guard marched behind the ark of the Lord, with the horns sounding all the time. And so they marched around the city once on the 2nd day and returned to the camp. They did this 6 days. On the 7th day, they rose at daybreak and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. That was the only day that they marched around the city 7 times. On the 7th round, as the priests blew the horns, Joshua commanded the people, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and everything in it are to be proscribed for the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot is to be spared, and all who are with her in her house, because she hid the messengers we sent. But you must be aware of that which is proscribed, or else you will be proscribed. If you take anything from that which is proscribed, you will cause the camp of Israel to be proscribed. You will bring calamity upon it.
All right, so proscribed means that it is off limits and will be destroyed. So all of the loot of the city, kind of, is going to be destroyed. This is not going to be an opportunity to run in and grab a new goat, or run in and grab a new pot, or grab someone's clothes, or anything like this. We're going to go in and we are going to raise the city and we are leaving. Make sense? And this was intended in many parts of the Tanakh in order to show that this was not a loot-taking operation, that this was simply a matter of taking control of what was ours, not taking their stuff. You have a question?
No, just thinking about the reasons why they were given for going into Iraq in the early 2000s. It'll pay for itself, don't worry. We're gonna get this oil, and it'll work out just fine. Yeah.
Often doesn't happen, but loot taking was the norm among most armies for most of human history. But notice what else is happening during all of this time, right? The 6 days and even the 7th days. At any point, the people of Jericho could have surrendered. At any point, right? They are being given an entire week to see what is coming up against them, to see the discipline of the troops, to see the organization of the camp, and to see the size of the camp, and to recognize that they need to make an arrangement. Right? They need to stop. And unfortunately, they don't. And if that sounds, again, similar to how our commentators read the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where they also were being given right up to the end a chance to repent, then that might explain why I brought this particular text to go with our earlier text. That this destruction is designed in order to highlight their opportunity to change, as well as to highlight that the victory doesn't belong to just the side with more spears, but will belong to the side that actually is walking in the paths of God. With that in mind, let's get to the big ending.
All the silver and gold and objects of copper and iron are consecrated to the Lord. They must go into the treasury of the Lord.
Right, which again, not coincidentally, those happen to be also things that are easily kosherable.
So the people shouted when the horns were sounded. When the people heard the sound of the horns, the people raised a mighty shout, and the wall collapsed. The people rushed into the city, every man straight in front of him, and they captured the city.
All right, so why did the wall fall?
Sounds like
We don't know.
sound.
All right, so it's going back. Remember our question about heaven when we started with Sodom and Gomorrah. Was this a physical, natural phenomenon?
Yeah.
Right? Can you blow over walls with shofar and people shouting? Probably not physically cause walls to crack with human voices. I mean, if you've ever been in a stadium and heard a big roar, yeah, it can be really, really loud and uncomfortable, but the stadium didn't collapse, and we wouldn't necessarily expect the walls of Jericho to collapse. On the other hand, if that is the appointed time for something to occur, say, for example, for Rahav to break part of the wall open because she happens to live in the wall and allow the people to come in, or say, for example, there were sappers, that there were Israelite engineers digging for a week under the city, and so they were under the cover of this parade going around the town, and at this moment, that was the signal to remove the beams and make the walls collapse. All of that is a possible physical and naturalistic explanation of what is happening here. But all of that still wouldn't matter if the people inside the city were brave, if the people inside the city were still ready to fight. But they had had their will sapped by everything that had happened over the last 40 years and watched our successes, and by watching what was happening in front of them for the last 7 days.
And it seems with the crossing of the Jordan River and all of that we were in last time, that there was some kind of earthquake stuff going on. So that might
have been an aftershock.
Yeah, it might have been an aftershock. And the feeling of, I don't know if you've ever been around a lot of
Troops.
Troops and people, but even the sheer, feeling of
Stomping at
100,000 people walking and stomping, you literally can feel the ground shake.
Absolutely.
It's very frightening.
Absolutely. Now, does that mean that it wasn't from heaven? Of course it doesn't mean it wasn't from heaven, right? The fact that it happened in the right way at the right time is what still makes this a heaven-sent victory. But what's more important than recognizing the miracle of God assisting with the victory of our conquest of Canaan is the fact that we had to be party to it, right? God did not simply wave a magic God wand and make all the Canaanites disappear.
Right.
When you're in league with the stones and the trees and the mountains, that comes from, is it Isaiah or?
Yes, yeah. To be, everything that is used as a weapon of war comes ultimately from God, and therefore God will not let it harm you, right? Because God is behind all of this. And the idea that God is demanding from us that we follow instructions, which we have trouble doing, but that we follow instructions and put ourselves on the line. But God will do his part in making sure that our victory is assured if we follow the rules. Right after this, if you continue reading the next chapter, you'll find out that we didn't all follow all the rules of the prescription. And that leads us to some big trouble when we get to our next battle. But that will have to be for future reading. But the important part here, again, is just like with Sodom and Gomorrah, God is using natural elements to do a supernatural sign, which can easily be denied by those who aren't willing to accept that God wants this to occur, but can also easily be used as instructions in more detail of how it is that we are meant to pursue these objectives. How do we punish? How do we go for justice? How do we wage war? And if we're willing to look for that, throughout the Tanakh, we will find many, many indications. Good? Good. Have a great day. Keep reading extra chapters. Remember, I'm just giving you guys snippets from the rest of the Tanakh. If you haven't read it with a good Jewish commentary, that can be your New Year's resolution for 5779.